68, Wood, Part 2, Charcoal, Barbecue, Mellowed Spirits, and a peek at war. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at charcoal and the important ways it made changes to what will soon become American food. But of course, to do that, we get to take a detour through the Iron Age and some long-neglected scholarship on the close proximity of charcoal and iron and Central and West African culture, and how that affected the rise of aged spirits, iron expertise, and the North American version of barbecue that will all come out of this century of food. Oh yeah, and how charcoal is tied to war. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know, that while making soot and charred wood has been going on as long as there's been lightning and organic matter to burn, and humans have been making it for as long as they've been burning wood for warmth, cooking, and light, the actual manufacture of charcoal purposefully in large batches to use it to make other things seems to have a start date, or at least a start era. And we're going to poke around the edges of that to bring ourselves up to the 18th century. So first of all, why make charcoal at all? Why go through the process of kind of burning wood if all you're going to do is burn the wood the rest of the way? Because charcoal burns at temperatures almost twice as hot as wood does. A smaller amount of charcoal burns longer and produces more heat than the same amount of wood. And it doesn't smoke like wood, and it's easier to control. No sap pockets, no knots, no surprises. For some of the more abstruse aspects of how charcoal burns hotter than wood, check into the Ice Science bonus episode that's about to go up. There I talk about things down to the chemical bond level for how this all works. But above that, I'll explain in this episode why, when it comes to a convenient and hot fire, it's charcoal over wood all the time. Then we can get to barbecue, tasty booze, and oh yeah, war. The earliest evidence found so far of on-purpose, large-scale charcoal manufacture has been dated to about 4000 BCE in Central Africa. There's plenty of debate and worry about contamination of stirred-together layers, but 6,000-ish years ago for these charcoal pits is reasonably well accepted. What it took to manufacture charcoal on purpose was a recognition that wood could be burned in a way that didn't burn it completely. The practical result was building a pit with a chimney of sorts in it, and then covering up the wood so it would only burn part way. What we know now is that the wood is burning in a low oxygen environment, and the result is that the more volatile, more reactive stuff is going to off-gas and burn away first. The nitrogen, the hydrogen, some potassium, calcium, and other stuff that reacts at lower temperatures and vaporizes first. Basically, this means all the stuff in wood that isn't carbon. For getting carbon to react takes higher temperatures and, most importantly, more oxygen. So creating charcoal from wood or other organic matter means driving off all the not carbon and leaving more or less pure blocks of solid carbon. This can later be activated by heat to start combining with the oxygen in the air and giving off more heat by forming the extremely stable carbon dioxide and some carbon monoxide as well, which is why in our well-sealed, pretty well-insulated modern houses, oh my goodness, do not ever burn charcoal indoors, in a brazier, in a grill, in anything. People in pre-industrial times and the Middle Ages could do that, but their houses were drafty and leaky and had plenty of circulation most of the time, though people still died of carbon monoxide poisoning and asphyxiation then as well. But now, the danger's pretty certain. So please, never burn anything bigger than a candle indoors unless you are in a working fireplace. Okay, safety message over. Anyway, when wood is burned in a low oxygen environment, all the water and other chemicals that are in there burn off, making for some pretty chemically bad for you smoke. But what is left over is generally stable, high heat, low smoke fuel. Because charcoal is a thing that simply happens, even though the earliest evidence of its manufacture resides in Central Africa, it's likely that charcoal manufacture was independently arrived at several times, especially since the shapes of pits and kilns to do so have so many different appearances, even though the basic process to make charcoal happens to be pretty much the same. While charcoal in and of itself is pretty tame, as blocks of more or less pure carbon, the uses it has been put to over the millennia are interesting and varied. because it and wood ash are such ubiquitous materials in the ages before fossil fuels. As with burning charcoal, many of these uses were also likely discovered repeatedly and independently. So besides being this nifty fuel, it was also noticed that charcoal would absorb bad odors and make dodgy tasting water taste better or sweeter. In areas where people lived and planted that had mostly swampy or brackish water, such as the West Coast African farmers, filtering water for drinking through charcoal made it safer and better tasting. And some early seafaring societies, such as the Phoenicians, and now we're getting way back in the way back here, found that barrels that had been charred to clean them were the best for storing water in, because the water stayed better tasting for longer. Charcoal as an ingredient for wellness and health has a long history, and some of it actually does what it says. Charcoal powder was an ingredient in some Egyptian poultices, as it was found to remove the bad smell from infected wounds. But some is utter nonsense, like drinking charcoal in detox drinks. Activated charcoal is useful in medical situations where a dangerous poison needs to be scooped up, but drinking it willy-nilly, hoping it will snag some mysterious unnamed toxin, but not run away with necessary vitamins and nutrients you need, is folly. Anyway, activated charcoal as shoe and general home deodorizers, good stuff. As toothpaste, no harm that I can see there, but drinking it in an unsupervised way, that could lead to unintended problems, all right. But this is the sort of silver bullet medical thinking popularized at the end of the 19th century as a way to make money that haunts us today. So let's turn back to the 18th century and burning charcoal. Wood, even when fanned or blown on with bellows to speed up the reactions that are going on during burning, its maximum temperature tops out at around 1,100 Fahrenheit or about 600 C. There's a lot of water in wood, even the dry stuff. And the non-carbon things burning in there simply don't form chemicals that are as stable as carbon dioxide, so don't release as much energy. And wood gives off a lot more soot, oily smoke, and unpleasant charred smells. But charcoal, with all the water and other volatiles removed, can burn at temperatures around 2,000 Fahrenheit or somewhere around 1,100 C, especially when it's in a setup that allows for more air to pass over the burning charcoal, adding more oxygen in faster. It can also be spread out and used in smaller pieces to create more sensible cooking temperatures. But grouped together and encouraged, charcoal gets hot enough to easily melt pure metals and, yes, smelt metals out of sand and rock ores. Messing about with charcoal and rocks. That's how we get to the Bronze and then the Iron Ages. Bronze, by the way, is an alloy of copper and tin. Its cousin brass is mainly copper and zinc. And sometimes the bronze-brass line can get a little wobbly because bronze often contains traces of other minerals which give it a variety of slightly different properties. Incidentally, as the ability to analyze metals has improved, the general label copper alloy gets used more often. Iron stuff was around during the different Bronze Ages of the world, but bronze was favored as copper and tin come out of their ores more easily and can often be found in pure veins. They melt at lower temperatures and their corrosion is easier to control. Both copper and tin and their alloys form a protective patina or skin that severely slows corrosion through the solid metal. A well-known example is that green skin on the Statue of Liberty. She's copper, but doesn't corrode away because that green patina protects the rest of the metal. The alloys also polish to different attractive colors of coppery to golden depending on the alloy composition. And the hardness of the alloys allows them to be pounded and polished to wickedly sharp edges. Iron, on the other hand, has an easier time corroding all the way through. And cast iron and even wrought iron are softer than bronze. But add in just the right amount of carbon and a few other trace minerals, and suddenly you have steel. The self-ventilating tall furnaces of sub-Saharan Africa were able to make higher carbon and thus harder steel than the steel made by the water-driven hammer furnaces of much of Europe. And in the end, once steel was developed, it really spelled the end of the Bronze Age. Once the technology was spun up, iron was simply cheaper. Iron ore is more plentiful, and the complex trade networks needed to get adequate copper and tin broke down as the world changed. Brass and bronze would continue to have a place where non-corrosive metal was important, but iron ruled the day. And as metal, especially iron, became more and more essential to the running of the world, charcoal, carbon, and iron technology would continue to develop side by side, especially in the Americas. While it's easy to find research materials on the history of charcoal burning in England and easy to trace early American charcoal burning in the northern colonies to English traditional practices, much less is known about the charcoal burning of the southern colonies, except for a few papers noting that large-scale charcoal burning took place in Central, West, and the Cape areas of Africa. Little Western scholarship was done until the 21st century to look at how the fate of the African continent has been shaped by charcoal burning and the associated uses of charcoal. For our purposes, it's important to note that the practice of creating and cooking with charcoal was a well-developed technology in Central and West Africa, where the bulk of the captives enslaved in the Americas came from. Their familiarity with charcoal, making it and cooking with it, and even using it as a medium for filtering all appear as important developments in American food processing. The first industry is blacksmithing. The nail, the absolutely essential binder of the 18th century, was a product of many a southern plantation. Thomas Jefferson, as with other cash-poor, land-rich men of his time, turned the industry of the people he owned to nail manufacture as a way to pay off some of his debts. As with the Cooper of popular image, we tend to slot in the image of a heavily muscled white man, but forget that a large number of the chains used to capture and transport Africans were forged by African smiths, sometimes of African metal, but later of the Swedish, Russian, and Prussian voyage iron used in the global trade game that encompassed, among other things, spice, spirits, and humans. America was built on cooking on iron, and after England had decided pursuing the French and Spanish was more important than other concerns, a fair amount of the industry of the New World was built on the mining, smelting, and forging of iron. Pennsylvania particularly, but also Virginia and the Carolinas proved to have decent iron deposits. They also had plenty of trees, which, once made into charcoal, were absolutely essential in the production of iron. As we exist in a world where we can design and have objects 3D printed in a variety of materials on a whim, we have to stop and consider the sheer effort and the long list of complex operations required to turn out a single nail. Sure, a fair amount of the effort is brute force, but where to apply the effort and in what directions to point the brute force still requires experience, judgment, and skill. I talk about the steps around iron in those episodes at the start of the seasons, but I skipped over charcoal. And here's an interesting thing I did not know. While wood was the primary fuel of the English in the 17th and 18th century, charcoal was the primary fuel for many Africans. Making charcoal and further using charcoal are skills not considered as being in the toolbox of enslaved people. We are taught about the production of raw materials like rice and cotton and indigo, but not about how much of the iron and steel industry that this country is built on comes from their making of charcoal for the production of that iron. And iron wasn't the only thing their charcoal expertise was used in making. Let's pause for a moment and bring back the barrel, particularly the wet barrel. The dry slack barrels could only get so dirty, and things contained in them had to be somewhat sturdy to survive transport in them. So cleaning out a slack barrel for another use wasn't such a big deal. It's true that transporting, say, deerskin, saltfish, and tobacco serially in the same barrel might affect the quality of one or the other, but all of those items go through several transformations before they're consumed at the end. And slack barrels simply had shorter lives than the more expensive and sturdier wet barrels. In the cooking world, the task of cleaning out a wet barrel between uses for, say, beer making, wine making, vinegar making, and pickle storage was important. There's pages on this in the back of cookbooks all the way into the 20th century. In an ideal world, the beer barrel would just stay the beer barrel until it was given over to, say, vinegar making. But there are instructions for scouring and sanitizing barrels as they went bad sometimes with one beer batch or another. A bit of burning brimstone, that is, sulfur, could help out with a barrel that maintained a disagreeable air. So it might not surprise you to learn that sometimes there were barrel contents that could not be expunged by even the most thorough scrubbing, rinsing, and applications of brimstone. And so sometimes a light char was applied to get that really stinky whatever smell out. And then the barrel would continue to be used. Remember, this is an age that recognized and appreciated the deodorizing capabilities of charcoal. There was no Febreze, there were no Glade plugins, there wasn't even Lysol. It was scrub with sand and open the windows. In the 18th century, we aren't that far away from strewing fresh rushes on the floor with a variety of nice herbs added in to get a better smell. Incense and fragrant woods burned in a fireplace and braziers were a regular part of daily life, as were perfumes, nosegays, pomanders, and censers. So using charcoal as a way to deal with unpleasant odors and strange flavors was well known. Tossing a chunk of charcoal into a stinky well to sweeten things up wasn't a strange procedure. Instead, it was more like a less sophisticated version of the millions of Brita filters deployed out there now. If you also recall for a second that we are encountering the rise of distilling, and the fact that distilled grain liquors, wheat, rye, corn, oats, and fruit brandies were on the rise with relatively cheaper and better constructed distilling equipment available to more people. You might see where charcoal is about to come into play. Rum's taking over the coast, but inland, where people are looking to store farm surpluses in a durable and easily spendable way, well, distilled alcohols was definitely an answer. And this, many people point to as where the charred barrel as a way to age and produce smoother distilled liquors comes from. Because before the 18th century, aging grain liquors wasn't particularly known or done. Wine, once on the road, oxidized in its barrels after a time, so wasn't aged in the bottle the way we do now. Remember, glass was still rare, expensive, and largely ornamental. Fortified wines like some sherries and Madeiras were taken through long aging in barrels that were heated and cooled repeatedly to smooth them out. And brandies were aged on occasion, but at this point, things like Applejack, Calvados, whiskey, and its forebearer Usquebaugh were mostly purpose-made for celebrations. Stored versions might be brought out for medicinal purpose, and those usually had arcane and medicinal mixtures associated with them. Storing the harsh-tasting distilled liquors in charred barrels that likely weren't so good for storing something like flour, but might smooth the edges out of a harsh liquor? Now here was something to try. And when it worked, it became something to both fiddle with and knowledge to guard carefully. I'll get more into the arcana of charcoal and mellowed spirits when charcoal and mellowed spirits becomes more important around 19th century distillation. Yes, I've been setting up a lot of, we'll talk about it later, distillation stuff, so this is just one more. Here in Woodland, it's simply important to acknowledge that the preciousness of the wet barrel and knowledge of charcoal's uses led to some experimentation that created a whole new class of American spirits. And this wasn't the only place where charcoal left its mark on what would become American-style celebration. For at last, we come to the origins of what will be American barbecue. Not barbecue generally. There's just too many things in too many places all over the world. I am purposefully sticking to our original hybrid, based on North American wood and iron culture, the mysterious mixing of Native American practices, African charcoal knowledge and cooking traditions, North American colonial ingredients, and a fair sprinkling of imported tidbits from the Caribbean and parts beyond via the pirate activities of the 18th century. Even before the two sides of the Atlantic met in any meaningful way, obviously the practice of cooking over an open fire was well known everywhere. The British were especially known for their entire oxen cookery, with young kine roasted whole and basted with their fat and otherwise manipulated to make a crispy skin, and the enjoyment of such ox roasts were seen as the culinary heights of native English cookery. But the fancy sort of people, even back in the 17th century, were looking at other spicy, tasty ways to cook meat over fires. Recipes for kebabs are to be found in recipe books this early. The desire for spiced meat cooked directly over a fire instead of just the glorious but likely hard to get oxen was something the English fancied. Meanwhile, in the Americas side of the world, smoking to keep meat good for longer was well afoot in the Caribbean and Florida. There was never any cold season to freeze dry provisions as was done with cod in Iceland and Nova Scotia. Instead, it was hot and often humid, the wrong weather generally for food preservation of any sort, unless it was bathed in smoke. This smoking of meat, fish, lizards, and other small game on a wooden grate over a low fire by the original inhabitants of the Caribbean is where we get the word barbacoa. Smoking, of course, was even done back in England. Chimneys, as they were being figured out, both on the island and in the New World frontier, often had a nook especially to hang a piece of meat around the fire and get it nice and dried out and smoky, so that it might later be hacked at and added back into stews as a variety of spoon meat. The Cherokee, the Catawba, and members of other confederations of tribes that lived within the mixed pine and hardwood forests around and to the south of the Chesapeake Bay knew which woods were best for this sort of smoking, and hickory was a favorite. In fact, some of the first smoked Virginia hams were the hindquarters of the escaped piggies brought by the interlopers, which were then cut up and eaten after digging up the locals' gardens. Yep, specifically using hickory to smoke Virginia hams is a habit picked up from the people who knew what wood was for what. The smokehouse out back of the cabin was set up by the settlers from England or Scotland or wherever, but the wood choice, that was local knowledge. The origin point of the word that would become barbacoa and barbecue has been pinned to the Caribbean, but there's no doubt that by the time it filtered north to Virginia, it had been chewed on by many a Spaniard and filtered through the polyglot speeches of pirates. So whatever it exactly meant to colonists in North America at that point is definitely up for some debate, other than it meant outdoor cookery, whole animals, fire, and a party. So somewhere through the pirate transfer of language, the tasty smoked hams from swine that had been gorging on Virginia acorns, and a knowledge of making charcoal and using it for long cooking over open fire, what was to become the modern ideas of American barbecue were making their debut in big parties on Virginia plantations, showing off a variety of butchered animals mopped in pepper-spiced vinegar. As I mentioned back in the cake episode, if you were making celebration food, you were going to make a lot of it. For when people showed up for a party, they were going to be there at least all day. And it wasn't unusual for them to be there for a week. It took an awfully long time to get anywhere. We may not like traveling in the dark or the rain, but when it was a matter of horses' ankles breaking or cartwheels getting stuck in the mud, delaying travel for better weather conditions had deeper meaning. There was no AAA to come pick you up. So large numbers of people did show up to this open fire outdoor pig and cow cookery at parties on Virginia plantations. And this, it seems, is where we can more or less plant the birth of what was to grow into the 100 forms and fights we now know as barbecue. As new ingredients and traditions and climates and uses of iron proliferate, so will styles of barbecue. But barrels of cider and beer, strong spirits, North American hardwood, hot fires, whole animals, vinegar and spices, and importantly, black cooks carrying around memories or stories of outdoor cookery with them, all were there at the beginning of barbecue. All things we owe to wood, barrels, and charcoal. Sure, not food, but without them, there wouldn't be American food at all. Now that feels like the end, but it's not quite. There's one more thing charcoal was useful for in the colonies. Gunpowder, black powder. In the 18th century, tiny little England was kind of at war all the time with someone, usually the French or the Spanish, sometimes the Dutch, and there was always the locals in the colonies at the fringes of the expanding empire to suppress. And a definite advantage the English had was with their metal machines of war. Though they weren't particularly useful without gunpowder, sulfur and the somewhat unstable nitrogen compound saltpeter or potassium nitrate was essential in its manufacture. England had secured their supply, well, much of the contemporary global supply in India. Adventuring in the kingdoms of India wasn't all about fine cloth and gemstones. But then there was the need for fine charcoal, and once again, the apparently inexhaustible forests of the New World would supply this war need. So here we are, the last piece in how charcoal would make American food what it is, supplying the iron for cannon, and an important ingredient in the power needed to fire them will play a huge role in separating the colonies from England, but also in their use of firearms and steel to change the future of the continent. I'll go more in depth with this as I get into my Revolutionary War episodes, but before we get too far ahead, let's get back to food. Next week, we will look at the role of deer in the growth of the frontier of the colonies, how they helped the colonists turn away from the coast as the only place to live and start thinking that a home away from connections to the home island might be possible, and not just for religious reasons, but the cash connection to fashionable London will not be ignored. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. And even if you don't have time to write something down, a few stars is always nice. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at THOA Food and in the show description.